Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little unsettling. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly disturbing in that slow, creeping way history tends to be. So go ahead and dim the lights, maybe pull a blanket over yourself, and settle into wherever you are right now. Tell me your time and place. It's oddly comforting to imagine all of us scattered across the world, drifting off together while talking about medieval weapons. Tonight, we're not looking at kings or grand battles. We're looking at the tools, the inventions, the objects people made when hitting each other wasn't efficient enough. And as it turns out, medieval people were extremely creative. Not always in a good way. When we think of medieval warfare, we imagine knights in shining armor, very cinematic, very heroic, and also very misleading. Most warfare was slow, uncomfortable, and deeply unpleasant. The weapons they used? They weren't elegant. They were practical, brutally so. Let's begin with something deceptively simple, something that doesn't look terrifying at all: the mace. At first glance, a mace is just a stick with a heavy lump at the end. You could imagine someone inventing it by accident, innovation. But the mace wasn't about cutting, it wasn't about elegance, it was about force. Medieval soldiers kept running into thick metal plates that turned swords into mildly annoying tapping devices. The person inside would mostly just stand there. So someone had a very practical thought. What if instead of trying to cut through the armor, we just hit it really, really hard? The mace didn't slice, it crushed. You swing this heavy object, and even if the armor doesn't break, the force transfers through. Bones crack, organs shift. It's less about visible damage and more about internal rearrangement, which is, when you think about it, quietly horrifying. Flanged maces had ridged edges that concentrated force. Why waste energy spreading out the impact when you could focus it? Efficiency, really. These weapons are carefully designed solutions to specific problems. Medieval warfare wasn't just about strength. It was about dark, uncomfortable problem solving. Imagine you're a soldier. Everyone is walking around in a personal metal fortress. Hitting each other isn't working, so you get more precise. Enter the war hammer. Not for furniture, unless your furniture was unusually aggressive. On one side, a flat head. On the other, a sharp spike. The spike wasn't meant to slice. It was meant to punch through armor, enough to make the person inside very aware that their armor was failing. What's fascinating is how specialized these weapons became. Not just hit the enemy, but hit them in exactly the right way. It's methodical. Now, while this happens on the battlefield, there's another kind of warfare taking shape. Slower, more patient. Siege warfare. Sometimes, instead of an army, you fight a wall, a very big wall, and this is where things get creative. Let's talk about the trebuchet. The trebuchet was enormous. A wooden structure with a counterweight system that could hurl objects over incredible distances. And, I mean, almost anything. Rocks, obviously. But when you're trying to break a siege, it's not just about destroying walls. It's about breaking morale, so they would launch unpleasant things. Animal carcasses, for example. The goal wasn't just impact, it was infection, disease. It's a strange kind of warfare. You're not directly attacking. You're introducing problems, letting nature do the work for you. Cold. Warfare at a distance. Quiet. Mechanical. Almost peaceful if you ignore everything about it. If the trebuchet was about distance, the crossbow brings things closer. It changed things in a particular way. It made killing easier. A longbow requires years of training. Strength, technique, skill. But a crossbow, you load it, aim it, and pull the trigger. That's it. Warfare becomes more accessible, less dependent on individual skill, not louder, just easier. And that, in its own way, is chilling. Take, for example, early incendiary weapons. Fire is simple, effective, and difficult to control. Depending on your perspective, a flaw or a feature. They experimented. They mixed substances to create something that would burn longer, stick better, spread faster, controlled chaos. Behind every weapon is a person. Craftsmen, engineers, soldiers. They weren't thinking in terms of horror. They were thinking in terms of effectiveness. When something becomes routine, it loses its shock. It just becomes part of life, or, in this case, part of war. So for now, let your mind settle on that image. A quiet battlefield, not much noise, just the slow, deliberate use of tools. And somewhere in the distance, a machine creaks, preparing to launch something you'd probably rather not think about. We'll pick up from there. So, let's gently pick up where we left off. You're still on that quiet battlefield. The air is still in that oddly heavy way it gets when a lot of people are waiting for something to begin. Somewhere in the distance, that great wooden machine, the trebuchet, is creaking like it's thinking very hard about its life choices. And now, we drift a little closer. Because, as effective as distance weapons were, medieval warfare had a habit of collapsing inward. Slowly, inevitably, everything moved closer. Walls were climbed, gates were broken, lines met. And when that happened, things became much more personal. Let's talk about the poleaxe. Now, the poleaxe is one of those weapons that looks like someone couldn't quite decide what they wanted. It's a long shaft, usually about the height of a person, topped with a combination of an axe blade, a hammer, and often a spike. But the design wasn't random. Every part had a purpose. The axe blade could hook or cut. The hammer could crush. The spike could pierce. It was a complete toolkit for dealing with armored opponents, which was basically everyone worth worrying about. When knights fought each other in full armor, it wasn't the wild, swinging chaos you might imagine. It was slower, measured, almost like a very uncomfortable dance. They would circle, probe, look for openings, weak points in the armor, gaps at the joints, places where metal met flesh, imperfectly. The poleaxe was perfect for this kind of fighting. You could hook an opponent's limb, pull them off balance. You could bring the hammer down on a helmet to persuade. And if someone fell, well, that's when the spike became very relevant. It's strange, isn't it? The more protected people became, the more targeted the violence had to be. Less about broad strikes. More about careful application of force. Almost surgical. Now, speaking of getting uncomfortably close, let's float over to something a little more compact. The rondel dagger. At first glance, it doesn't look particularly terrifying. It's small, simple, a narrow blade with a round guard, hence the name. But this was not a weapon for open combat. This was a weapon for the moment after. In fact, many fights ended with one person on the ground, still very much alive, but no longer in a position to continue. The rondel dagger was designed to find those places. It wasn't about swinging, it was about inserting, carefully, deliberately. There's a quiet intimacy to it, a closeness that's hard to ignore. No distance, no grand gestures. Now, if that feels a little too close, don't worry. Medieval warfare had plenty of ways to step back again. Let's talk about the longbow. It requires years of training, physical strength, and a certain level of dedication that most people would politely decline. Longbowmen could fire arrows at impressive distances with surprising accuracy, a steady rhythm of draw, release, like breathing. And then there's the arrows, broadheads for cutting, bodkin points for piercing armor. They optimized the arrows too. Instead of individual shots, you'd get volleys, arrows rising into the air, briefly visible against the sky, and then descending. It's less about precision and more about probability. If enough arrows fall into a space, someone is going to have a very bad day. Now, while arrows were falling from above, something else was happening on the ground. Let's ease into early gunpowder weapons. Yes, gunpowder. These were experimental, crude, unpredictable, occasionally more dangerous to the user than the target. One of the earliest forms was the hand cannon. It was essentially a metal tube attached to a stick, but when it did work, it introduced a different kind of force, one that didn't rely on muscle or momentum in the same way. Armor, which had been evolving for centuries, suddenly had a new problem, a small, fast-moving projectile powered by an explosion. Now, let's drift back into the broader rhythm of siege warfare. Medieval conflict revolved around waiting outside walls, waiting for supplies to run out, waiting for morale to break, and sometimes giving that process a nudge. Let's talk about siege towers. Imagine a tall wooden structure on wheels, built to be roughly the height of the walls it's approaching. The idea was simple. Roll the tower up to the wall, drop a bridge, and suddenly you have a direct path from outside to inside. So siege towers became moving targets. Arrows, stones, fire. Lots of fire. It's not a dramatic explosion. It's a gradual intrusion. These tools, they're not just about destruction. They're about control. Control of distance. Control of space. Control of time. It's a constant cycle, and it never really stops. So as you settle a little deeper, just keep that quiet image in mind. A world where every problem has a solution, and every solution tends to create a new problem. We'll continue from there. All right, let's drift back in. Everything is still moving at that same unhurried pace. No rush, no urgency. Just the quiet continuation of a world where people spent a surprising amount of time thinking about how to solve very specific, very human problems. And one of those problems, as it turns out, was this. What do you do when the enemy is above you, and you'd rather they weren't? Because height in medieval warfare was everything. If you had the high ground, yes, long before it became a meme, you had an advantage. You could see more. You could reach farther. You could drop things. And medieval defenders really liked dropping things. Let's talk about that. Specifically, let's talk about gravity as a weapon. It sounds almost too simple to count, but in practice, it was one of the most reliable tools. If someone was climbing your wall, approaching your gate, or standing inconveniently close to your fortifications, you didn't necessarily need anything fancy. You just needed something heavy. Rocks, for example. Large ones. Carefully collected and stacked along the top of walls, just waiting for the right moment. There's something almost peaceful about it. The preparation, the quiet anticipation, and then a simple push. No complex mechanism, no elaborate design. Just gravity doing what it has always done, consistently and effectively. But of course, medieval engineers weren't content to stop there. Because if dropping rocks worked, what if you dropped something worse? Which brings us gently to boiling liquids. Now, there's a common image of defenders pouring boiling oil over attackers. And while that did happen occasionally, oil was expensive. You didn't just waste it casually. Medieval people were not usually careless with resources, so instead they used what they had. Water. Heated until it became very persuasive. Or sometimes sand. Heated until it behaved in ways sand normally doesn't. Because hot sand has a particularly unpleasant habit of getting into small spaces. Armor joints. Gaps. Places you'd really prefer it didn't go. It's not flashy, it's not dramatic, it's just uncomfortable in a very thorough way. And again, there's that pattern. Not just stopping the enemy, but making the experience of trying to advance deeply unappealing. Now, If you're the one on the ground looking up at all of this, you might start to feel like the situation is slightly unfair, and you'd be right. So naturally, people came up with ways to even things out. Let's ease into one of the more persistent solutions, the battering ram. At its core, the idea is almost charmingly straightforward. You take a large, heavy beam, and then you swing it repeatedly into something. A gate, for example, and you keep doing that, over and over, patiently, rhythmically, like a very aggressive metronome. Thud, pause, thud, pause. It's not fast, it's not elegant, it's just persistent. And over time, that persistence pays off. Wood splinters, hinges strain. Of course, the defenders are not just going to stand there and watch this happen, so the ram operators needed protection. Which brings us to one of the more quietly named inventions, the tortoise. No, this was a covered structure placed over the battering ram. Arrows would hit the roof, stones would bounce off. Fire was a bit more complicated. It's almost cozy in a strange way. Now, while all of this is happening at ground level, there's another approach unfolding. Underground. Let's talk about mining. This is a different kind of digging, purposeful, strategic, quiet. The idea was to tunnel beneath a wall and remove support, and then, eventually, the wall would collapse. Not with a dramatic explosion, just a slow, inevitable sinking, a shift, a crack. Of course, defenders were aware of this, which led to one of the more subtle aspects of siege warfare, listening. They would place their ears to the ground or use simple devices to detect vibrations, the faint sounds of digging, scraping, and if they did hear it, then the response began. Countermining, digging their own tunnels to intercept the attackers. Now let's drift back above ground, because while all of this is unfolding, there's still room for improvisation. Take, for example, the humble caltrop. You scatter them on the ground, and suddenly that ground becomes less inviting. For people, yes, but more importantly, for horses. No loud clash, no dramatic moment, just a horse stepping in the wrong place and everything changing. It's almost passive. Now, as we continue, you might notice something else, a kind of patience. These weapons are about wearing the enemy down, gradually. Let's gently return to fire for a moment, because while we've mentioned it before, there's a particular use of it. Fire arrows. Simple in concept. You take an arrow, light it, and send it on its way. It's exactly as unpredictable as it sounds, not about overwhelming force, about creating multiple problems at once. If someone is busy putting out a fire, they're not watching the wall. Now, as we settle into the rhythm of all this, notice how interconnected everything is. Every weapon feeds into a system, a way of thinking, and that way of thinking is simple. Find the weakness. If the enemy is strong in one area, don't attack that area. Look elsewhere. Adapt. So, as you relax a little more, letting your thoughts drift, just imagine that landscape. Not loud, not chaotic, but full of quiet intention. People building, testing, adjusting, always looking for that small advantage, that slight edge, and finding it in the most unexpected places. We'll keep drifting through it. All right, we'll continue. By now, the battlefield has started to feel less like a place of sudden violence and more like a slow workshop. A place where ideas are tested, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, and then quietly improved. No rushing, no loud drama, just people over time figuring things out in ways that feel oddly patient. And one of those problems, as it turns out, was this. What do you do when the enemy is above you, and you'd rather they weren't? Because height, in medieval warfare, was everything. If you had the high ground, yes, long before it became a meme, you had an advantage. You could see more, you could reach farther, You could drop things, and medieval defenders really liked dropping things. Let's talk about that. Specifically, let's talk about gravity as a weapon. It sounds almost too simple to count, but in practice, it was one of the most reliable tools available. If someone was climbing your wall, approaching your gate, or standing inconveniently close, you didn't necessarily need anything fancy. You just needed something heavy. Rocks, for example, large ones. There's something almost peaceful about it. The preparation, the quiet anticipation, and then a simple push. No complex mechanism, no elaborate design, just gravity doing what it has always done, consistently and effectively. But of course, medieval engineers weren't content to stop there, because if dropping rocks worked, what if you dropped something worse? Which brings us gently to boiling liquids. Now, there's a common image of defenders pouring boiling oil over attackers, and while that did happen occasionally, oil was expensive. Medieval people were many things, but careless with resources was not usually one of them. So instead, they used what they had. Water, heated until it became very persuasive. Or sometimes sand, heated until it behaved in ways sand normally doesn't, because hot sand has a particularly unpleasant habit of getting into small spaces, armor joints, gaps, places you'd really prefer it didn't go. It's not flashy, it's just uncomfortable in a very thorough way. Now, if you're the one on the ground looking up at all of this, you might start to feel like the situation is slightly unfair. And you'd be right. So naturally, people came up with ways to even things out. Let's ease into one of the more persistent solutions, the battering ram. At its core, the idea is almost charmingly straightforward. You take a large, heavy beam and you swing it repeatedly into something like a gate. And you keep doing that, over and over, patiently, rhythmically, like a very aggressive metronome. Thud, pause, thud, pause. It's not fast, it's not elegant, it's just persistent. And over time, wood splinters, hinges strain, structures begin to reconsider their life choices. Of course, the defenders are not just going to stand there, which brings us to one of the more quietly named inventions, the tortoise. Not an animal, sadly. No, this was a covered structure placed over the battering ram to shield the people using it. Arrows would hit the roof. Stones would bounce off. It's almost cozy, in a strange way. A little group of people huddled under a wooden shell. Now, while all of this is happening at ground level, there's another approach unfolding, underground. Let's talk about mining. This is a different kind of digging, purposeful, strategic, quiet. The idea was to tunnel beneath a wall and weaken its foundations, and then eventually the wall would collapse, not with an explosion, just a slow, inevitable sinking, a shift, a crack, and then absence. Of course, defenders were aware of this, which led to one of the more subtle aspects of siege warfare, listening. Yes, listening. It becomes almost meditative, sitting quietly, waiting, trying to hear something that isn't supposed to be there. And if they did hear it, then the response began. Counter-mining, digging their own tunnels to intercept the attackers. Now, let's drift back above ground for a moment, because while all of this is unfolding, there's still room for improvisation. Take, for example, the humble caltrop. It's a small object, simple. One point is always facing upward. That's the whole design. You scatter them on the ground, and suddenly that ground becomes less inviting, especially for horses. Cavalry relied on speed and momentum, and caltrops disrupted that in a very quiet, very effective way. No loud clash, just everything changing. These weapons, these strategies, they're not about quick victories. They're about wearing the enemy down, like a slow, steady rain. Let's gently return to fire for a moment. Fire arrows. Simple in concept. You light it and then send it on its way. It creates not just damage, but distraction. Small fires starting in different places, drawing attention, forcing defenders to split their focus. Every weapon, every tactic, every small innovation feeds into something larger, a system, a way of thinking. Find the weakness. So as you relax a little more, just imagine that landscape. Not loud, not chaotic, but full of quiet intention. People building, testing, adjusting, always looking for that small advantage. We'll keep drifting through it. All right, let's continue, nice and slowly. By now, the battlefield has almost faded into something abstract. Not a place of sudden clashes, but a quiet system of ideas, tools, responses, adjustments. A long conversation between people who are trying, in their own steady way, to gain just a little more control. And sometimes, that search for control led to things that feel a bit more personal again. Let's gently move into the world of traps. Not large, obvious constructions, not towering machines, just small, carefully placed inconveniences, the kind that wait. Because one of the simplest ways to deal with an enemy is not to face them directly, but to shape where they can go. Imagine a narrow path, or a breach in a wall. Somewhere attackers are almost certain to move through, and in that space, just beneath the surface, something has been prepared. A pit, perhaps, covered lightly with branches, dirt, just enough to look solid, until it isn't. What's interesting about traps is how quiet they are. There's no moment of action until there is. No warning, no build-up. It's a different kind of weapon, one that relies on expectation, on the assumption that the ground will behave the way it always has. Now, if traps are about shaping movement, let's drift into something that shapes behavior in a slightly different way. Fear. Not the loud, overwhelming kind, but the slow, creeping version, the one that builds over time. Let's talk about display weapons. These weren't always used in direct combat. Sometimes their purpose was simply to be seen. Large, imposing, slightly exaggerated in design. Weapons that looked intimidating because hesitation matters. A second of doubt. That can be enough to shift the balance in a close encounter. Now, let's move towards something that blends practicality with a certain ingenuity. The billhook. Originally, it wasn't even a weapon. It was a tool used for cutting vegetation, managing hedges, general agricultural work. And then, at some point, someone looked at it and thought, this could be useful for something else. So it was adapted, extended, reinforced, sometimes modified. Suddenly, this simple farming tool became something quite effective on the battlefield, because the hook could be used to pull, to catch, to disrupt. A rider, once unseated, loses a significant advantage. Now, as we continue drifting, let's return for a moment to something a bit more mechanical. Early repeating mechanisms. The desire to increase output, to reduce the time between actions, because in a battlefield context, time is everything. Now let's gently shift towards something that feels a little more environmental. Weather. Rain, for example, affects movement. Mud slows everything down, makes footing uncertain, changes the way weapons behave. Choose when to engage, when to wait, when to let the environment do some of the work for you. Now, as we settle further into this calm rhythm, let's touch on endurance. Holding a position, maintaining pressure, the ability to remain steady, to trust that small actions, repeated over and over, will lead to something. It's almost meditative. Now, let's bring in one more object, something simple but with a very specific purpose. The sling. Understated, almost humble. And yet, it works, which in the end is what all of these tools have in common. Small changes, careful improvements, gentle persistence, we'll continue drifting. All right, we'll keep going. By now, everything has softened into that same steady rhythm. No sharp edges, no sudden turns. Just a long, quiet drift through a world where people kept solving problems. One small idea at a time. And as those ideas accumulated, something interesting began to happen. Weapons didn't just become more effective, they became heavier. Not always in a literal sense, but in the way they shaped the battlefield, the way they changed how people moved, thought, and even stood. Let's ease into one of the simplest examples of this, the shield. Now, a shield doesn't sound terrifying. It's defensive, passive, almost comforting, something you hold between yourself and danger, like a small portable wall. But over time, shields became more than just protection. They became tools of control. Large shields especially could dictate space. When soldiers stood together, shields overlapping, they created something close to a moving barrier, a line that could advance slowly, steadily, absorbing impact. Not rushing, not reacting, just continuing forward. There's something quietly intimidating about that kind of movement. Not because it's fast or aggressive, but because it's consistent, predictable in the most unyielding way. And once that line reached you, well, the rest of the tools we've talked about started to matter again. Now, if shields represent stability, let's drift towards something that represents the opposite. Momentum. Specifically, cavalry. A mounted charge, at the right moment, could feel almost inevitable. A build-up of motion, speed, gathering gradually. Hooves striking the ground in a rhythm that becomes harder to ignore as it gets closer. It's not just the impact, it's the anticipation. And the weapons used by cavalry reflected that. Lances, for example. Long, straight, designed for a single, focused purpose, to transfer the energy of motion into a point. The rider doesn't need to swing. The horse provides the force. The lance simply directs it. It's efficient, and also temporary, because a lance is often used once, maybe twice, before it breaks or becomes impractical, which means cavalry needed to transition quickly, from that initial moment of impact into something else, swords, maces, secondary options. It's a layered approach, one action flowing into the next. Now, as we move away from open fields and back toward enclosed spaces, let's revisit something we touched on earlier, but from a slightly different angle: confined combat. Because not all fighting happened in wide, open areas. Sometimes it happened in narrow corridors, gatehouses, stairwells, places where movement was limited and long weapons became inconvenient. In those spaces, shorter weapons took over. Clubs, short swords, even simple knives. And the nature of combat changed. Less room to maneuver, less time to think. Actions become smaller, more contained, almost compressed. It's not about sweeping movements anymore. It's about efficiency in tight spaces, quick decisions, minimal motion. And again, there's that sense of adaptation, of adjusting to the environment rather than trying to force it. Now, speaking of environments, let's gently move into something that sits between weapon and terrain: fortifications themselves. Because walls, towers, gates, these aren't just passive structures. They're designed with very specific interactions in mind. Arrow slits, for example. Narrow openings in walls that allow defenders to fire projectiles while remaining mostly protected. From the outside, they're small, almost insignificant. But from the inside, they widen, giving the defender a better angle. It's a clever bit of geometry. And it turns the wall itself into a kind of weapon. Not something you swing or launch, but something that shapes the way an attack unfolds. Similarly, machicolations, those openings along the top of walls, allowed defenders to drop objects directly downward. Stones, debris, anything that gravity could assist with. Again, simple, direct, effective. It's interesting how often the simplest ideas persist. Now, as we continue this slow walk through medieval ingenuity, let's touch on something that feels almost modern: standardization. Over time, weapons began to follow more consistent patterns, shapes, sizes, materials, not perfectly uniform but more predictable. And that predictability had advantages: easier training, easier repair, easier replacement. It's a subtle shift, but an important one, moving from individual craftsmanship towards something closer to a system. And systems tend to scale, which means more people equipped, more quickly, with tools that behave in expected ways. Again, not dramatic, just efficient. Now, let's drift towards something that sits at the edge of all this practicality: fatigue. Because for all the clever designs, all the thoughtful strategies, there's a human element that doesn't change. People get tired, armor is heavy, weapons require effort. Holding a position for hours, days, sometimes longer, it takes a toll. And that fatigue becomes part of the battlefield. Movements slow, reactions dull, decisions become less precise. And in that state, even simple weapons can become more effective, not because they've changed, but because the person facing them has. It's a quiet reminder that no matter how advanced the tools become, they're still used by people, and people have limits. Now, before we drift too far, let's bring in one more idea: redundancy. In medieval warfare, relying on a single approach was risky. So people layered their strategies, multiple weapons, multiple tactics. If one thing failed, another could take its place. It's a kind of safety net, not perfect, but better than nothing. And over time, that layering creates complexity. A battlefield where many different elements are interacting at once, all contributing to the overall shape of the conflict. So as you settle even deeper, imagine that layered world, not chaotic, intricate. A place where every tool has a role, where progress doesn't come in sudden leaps, but in quiet, steady steps. We'll keep drifting forward. All right, let's gently bring everything together. By now, the battlefield we've been drifting through has changed shape so many times it almost feels familiar. Not in a comfortable way, exactly, but in a way that makes sense. A place built slowly, piece by piece, through careful thought, repeated effort, and a steady stream of small, practical ideas. No single invention defined it. No single moment transformed it. Instead, it was all of these things: maces, pikes, towers, tunnels, fire, patience, layered over one another, forming something complex, something adaptive, something very human. And as we move toward the end of this quiet journey, there's one final shift to notice. Not a loud one, not a dramatic turning point, just a gradual change in direction. Because all of these medieval weapons, for all their ingenuity, were part of a system that relied on certain assumptions. Strength mattered. Distance could be managed. Armor could protect. Walls could hold. And for a long time, those assumptions worked. Until, slowly, they didn't. Let's return, just for a moment, to those early gunpowder weapons we touched on before. The crude hand cannons. The unpredictable bursts of force that didn't quite fit into the established patterns. At first they were curiosities, interesting but not essential, another tool among many. But over time, they improved. A little more reliable, a little more powerful, a little easier to use. And as that happened, something subtle began to shift. Armor, which had been carefully refined over centuries, started to reach its limits. You could make it thicker, yes, heavier, more protective. But that came with trade-offs. Mobility decreased, fatigue increased, and eventually there was a quiet realization. You can't keep adding weight forever. At the same time, fortifications, those towering walls, those carefully designed defenses, faced a similar challenge. Because gunpowder didn't just change personal combat, it changed how structures responded to force. Walls that could resist stones and rams behaved differently when faced with explosive impact. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, noticeably. And so, the long cycle of adaptation began to turn again, not toward sharper blades or heavier maces, but toward something else entirely, something louder, faster, less dependent on physical strength and more on controlled energy. But that's a story that belongs just beyond the medieval world. And here, at the edge of it, everything feels quieter. Because if you look back over everything we've explored tonight, there's a pattern that stands out. Not the violence, not the conflict, but the thinking. Every weapon, every tactic, every small adjustment came from the same place. A simple question: how do we solve this problem? And the answers, while sometimes unsettling, were rarely chaotic. They were deliberate, measured, built on observation and experience. Even the most intimidating weapons we've talked about weren't created for spectacle. They weren't designed to shock or impress. They were designed to work, to do a job. And that practicality gives them a certain stillness, a sense that, for the people who made and used them, this wasn't extraordinary. It was just part of life, part of the world they understood, which, from where we're sitting now, feels a little strange, because we look for meaning in these things, to interpret them as symbols of something larger: fear, power, control. And those interpretations aren't wrong, but they're also layered on top of something simpler: people building tools, people adapting, people responding to the challenges around them in the only ways they knew how. And in that sense, these weapons are less about terror and more about persistence, about the quiet, steady effort to shape the world, even in difficult circumstances. Now, as we let all of this settle, imagine that battlefield one last time, but not in motion. No marching, no building, no testing, just stillness. The machines at rest, the weapons set aside, the walls standing for now without pressure. A pause. Because history, for all its movement, is made up of these pauses. Moments where nothing is happening, but everything that has happened still lingers. And in that quiet space, the details become softer, the edges blur, the weight of it all becomes lighter, not gone, just distant. So as you drift further into that calm, maybe your thoughts slowing, maybe the images fading a little, just hold on to that final idea, that even in a world shaped by conflict, there was a kind of quiet logic at work, a steady rhythm of problem and solution. And in that rhythm, something almost peaceful, not because of what it was, but because of how it moved. Slowly, gently, one small step at a time. And with that, we can let the scene fade. Good night. In the early months of 1348, somewhere in a modest stone house on a narrow street in Florence, a family of 6 went about their routines with a kind of quiet confidence that only comes from believing tomorrow will look very much like today. The father kept ledgers. The mother worried about bread and laundry. The children argued over nothing important. The grandmother sat near the window, watching people pass and silently judging them, as grandmothers have always done. Nothing seemed particularly unusual, and that, as it turns out, was the problem. Because the Black Death did not arrive like a dramatic storm with thunder and warning bells. It slipped in quietly. It came with ships, with traders, with fabrics and spices, with fleas that did not care about trade agreements or family bonds. It came, very politely, into homes like this one, and then it stayed. At first, it was just a rumor. Someone down the street had fallen ill. A neighbor, perhaps. Maybe a servant. People whispered the usual things. Bad air, divine punishment, something they ate. Someone always knows exactly what the problem is, right up until they don't. The father, being practical, likely dismissed it, because that's what people do. You don't assume the end of your family line because someone coughed 3 houses away. You assume it will pass. You assume you are not the kind of person bad things happen to. And for a few days, maybe even a week, he would have been right. Then, one morning, one of the children didn't get out of bed. It wasn't dramatic. No thunderclap. Just a fever. A quiet complaint. The kind of thing that usually meant rest, a bit of broth, and perhaps a lecture about not playing in the cold. But the fever did not go away. Instead, it climbed. Slow at first, then with a kind of stubborn determination. The child became restless, skin flushed, eyes glassy, and somewhere along the way, small dark swellings began to appear. Under the arms, along the neck, in places that were not supposed to swell. The mother noticed first. Of course she did, and now the house felt different. It's interesting how quickly a home can shift from comfort to unease. The same walls, the same chairs, but now everything feels slightly wrong. Conversations become quieter, movements slower, as if noise itself might make things worse. The father, still clinging to reason, might have said it was just an illness, a passing thing, but even he would have noticed the speed at which the child declined. Within a couple of days, the child was no longer arguing, no longer restless, just still, and that silence. That's when it begins to spread. Not just the disease, the silence, because now no one is speaking as freely. The grandmother watches, but even she has nothing to say. The mother moves quickly, but without confidence. The father stops making plans for next week. The house is holding its breath, and then, almost inevitably, someone else falls ill. It rarely stopped with one. Perhaps it was the mother next. That would make sense. She was closest. She cared for the child. She wiped the fevered brow. She adjusted blankets. She stayed too close for too long, and the disease, being completely indifferent to love, accepted her efforts as an invitation. Her symptoms would mirror the child's: fever, weakness, those same terrible swellings. And now the house is no longer holding its breath. It is sinking. The father at this point faces a quiet but impossible calculation. Stay and care for his family, or distance himself in the hope of survival. It sounds like a choice. It isn't really. Most stayed, not because they were foolish, but because leaving your family to die alone requires a kind of coldness that most people simply do not have. Even in a time when survival instincts should have taken over, many chose presence over safety. So he stays, and within days, he too begins to feel it. At this point, the pattern is clear, but clarity does not equal control. Knowing what is happening does not stop it. The grandmother, who has seen more years than the rest, might hold out longer. Sometimes age worked in strange ways during the plague. Some older individuals survived longer, perhaps by chance, perhaps by prior exposure to something similar, or perhaps just to witness the entire unraveling, which feels a bit unfair if you think about it. She watches as the house changes again. No more cooking, no more arguments, no more routine, just illness. One by one, the members of the family become still, not all at once. That would be almost merciful. Instead, it happens in sequence, each loss stretching the days into something heavy and indistinct. And here is the part that often gets overlooked. There is no proper grieving. Grief, in normal times, has a structure, time to process, rituals, community support. During the Black Death, none of that really applied, because while one person was dying, another was already ill. And while you might want to mourn, you are also trying to survive. Emotion becomes postponed or compressed or simply pushed aside. In some cases, bodies remained in the house longer than anyone would have wanted, not out of neglect, but because there was no one left strong enough to move them, or no one willing to come inside. Neighbors who might once have helped now kept their distance. Doors stayed closed, windows barely opened. Fear turned entire streets into quiet corridors of isolation. Eventually, someone might come, a cart, workers tasked with collecting the dead, not ceremoniously, not gently, just efficiently, because when entire families are dying, efficiency becomes the priority. And so the house empties, not gradually, in the way families usually disperse over generations, but suddenly, completely. The ledger remains unfinished. The bread, if there was any, goes stale. The grandmother's chair stays by the window, but no one sits in it, and perhaps, days later, someone else walks by and notices the door slightly ajar. But they do not go inside, because by now, everyone knows. This was not an unusual story. It happened again and again, across cities, across villages, entire households erased within the span of a week or two, sometimes faster. In some places, records show streets where only one or two individuals survived out of dozens of families. Imagine that for a moment. Not just losing your relatives, but your entire social world. The baker, the neighbor, the person you nod to every morning, gone. And the strange thing is, life did not stop. It couldn't. Some people survived, not because they were stronger or smarter, but often just because the disease didn't reach them in the same way. And these survivors had to navigate a world that was suddenly empty. Homes like the one in Florence stood as quiet reminders. Doors closed, windows dark, entire family lines ending without ceremony. Property became a complicated issue. If a whole family died, who owned the house? Who inherited anything? Legal systems, already fragile, struggled to keep up. Sometimes distant relatives appeared. Sometimes neighbors claimed things. Sometimes everything simply stayed as it was, slowly decaying. There is something oddly unsettling about that. Not destruction, not fire, just absence. Let's drift gently to another similar home, this time in a small village somewhere in England. The pattern is familiar now. A family, perhaps slightly larger, maybe 8 or 9 people, a mix of generations, more hands to work the land, more voices in the house. At first, they hear about the sickness in distant towns. It feels far away, almost unreal. News traveled slowly, and disbelief traveled even faster. They continue their routines. Fields need tending, animals need feeding. Life, even in the shadow of uncertainty, goes on. Then the sickness arrives, not announced, not explained, just present. Perhaps it begins with a farmhand or a visiting trader. The exact origin often remained unclear. What mattered was what followed. One person falls ill, then 2, then more. Unlike the city, where help might eventually come, villages faced a different problem. Isolation worked both ways. It could delay the arrival of disease, but once it was there, it also limited assistance. Families became their own caretakers, and when entire families were affected, there was no backup. In some recorded cases, entire villages were left nearly empty, fields untended, livestock wandering, houses abandoned. But again, the experience at the family level is quieter, more personal. Imagine a mother trying to care for multiple sick children at once, moving from bed to bed, offering water, whispering reassurances she doesn't fully believe, watching each child follow the same path. It's not dramatic, it's repetitive. And that repetition is what made the Black Death so psychologically devastating. There was no mystery after a point, no suspense. People knew what was coming. They just couldn't stop it. In some families, one person might survive. A single child, a parent, someone who recovers slowly while everyone else does not. And that survival comes with its own weight, because now they are alone. No siblings, no parents, no immediate support system. Just a house that feels too large, too quiet, and filled with memories that no longer have anyone to share them with. It's a different kind of tragedy, less visible perhaps, but just as lasting. And as we let this settle, as the quiet of these emptied homes lingers, we can begin to see the Black Death not just as a massive historical event, but as a collection of deeply personal endings. Not wars, not grand battles, just families, living ordinary lives, until they weren't. And with that, let's slowly move forward, to see what happened in places where entire noble households, not just ordinary families, faced the same quiet unraveling. Now, if you imagine that wealth, status, and a very confident coat of arms somehow made noble families immune to the Black Death, well, that would have been a comforting thought at the time. Unfortunately, the plague did not care about lineage, titles, or how impressive your family tree looked on parchment. If anything, large noble households, with their constant movement of servants, guests, and goods, sometimes made things worse. More people meant more contact. More contact meant more opportunity for the disease to settle in and make itself very comfortable. So let's drift into one of these grand households. A manor, perhaps. Stone walls, multiple rooms, a small army of servants, and a family that has spent generations carefully building its name, its land, and its reputation. Everything looks stable, permanent even, which, historically speaking, is often when things start to fall apart. At first, the news reaches them in the same way it reached everyone else, quietly, indirectly. Reports from nearby towns, a few deaths here and there, the usual explanations, bad air, divine displeasure, unfortunate timing, nothing that couldn't be managed with a bit of distance and a lot of confidence. The lord of the house, likely convinced of his own importance, might decide to simply wait it out. After all, this is a man used to controlling outcomes, crops, tenants, disputes. Why would this be any different? So precautions are taken, visitors limited, supplies monitored, maybe even a quiet decision to avoid certain towns. It all feels very reasonable, and then one of the servants falls ill. Servants, of course, were the connective tissue of noble life. They moved between rooms, handled food, cleaned spaces, carried messages. If the plague entered through a servant, it didn't just enter the household. It spread through its very structure. At first, the illness might be dismissed. Servants fell ill sometimes. It was unfortunate, but not unusual. But then another servant becomes sick, and then another. And now the household starts to feel uneasy. The Lord, perhaps still trying to maintain control, might order the sick to be isolated, moved to separate quarters, given minimal contact. It sounds like a plan. But plans during the Black Death had a tendency to unravel quickly, because by the time symptoms appeared, the disease had often already spread. So while the sick are being isolated, others are already carrying it, quietly, invisibly, moving through the halls, attending to duties, unaware that they are part of the next wave. And then, inevitably, it reaches the family itself. Perhaps it is the youngest child first. That seems to be a recurring and particularly cruel detail in many accounts. Children, being less cautious and more physically vulnerable, often fell ill early. The child develops a fever, nothing alarming at first, but in a household already on edge, every symptom now feels heavier. The mother notices. Of course she does. And suddenly, the grand manor, with all its rooms and corridors, feels much smaller, because illness has a way of shrinking space. It pulls everything inward. Focus narrows. Conversations become whispers. Movement becomes careful, almost hesitant. The child's condition worsens. The same pattern we saw before begins to unfold, but now within walls that were supposed to offer protection. Wealth does not change the symptoms. It does not slow the progression. It simply provides a slightly more comfortable setting for the same outcome. And here's where things take on a particularly strange tone. Noble families were used to structure, order, hierarchy. There was always someone in charge, always a plan, always a sense of control. The plague dismantled that quietly. As more members of the household fall ill, roles begin to blur. Servants who remain healthy may refuse to enter certain rooms. Some might leave altogether. Loyalty, while admirable, has its limits when faced with a disease that spreads this quickly. The lord of the house may try to enforce order. Commands are given, instructions repeated. But authority loses its edge when people are afraid. And fear in this context is very practical. So the household begins to thin. Servants disappear. Some flee. Some fall ill themselves. Tasks go undone. Meals become irregular. The smooth operation of noble life, once taken for granted, starts to falter. Meanwhile, within the family, the situation grows more serious. The child, likely the first to fall ill, may not recover, and here again we see that quiet, almost unbearable shift. The loss of a child in any era is devastating, but during the Black Death, it often came with a kind of emotional compression. There is grief, certainly, but it is quickly overshadowed by the realization that others are now at risk. Because by the time one family member dies, another is already showing symptoms. Perhaps the mother next. She has been caring for the child, staying close, ignoring her own exhaustion. And the disease once again accepts this closeness without hesitation. Her illness progresses quickly. The Lord, now faced with the simultaneous loss of control, both in his household and his family, may begin to experience something unfamiliar. Helplessness. It's a quiet kind of realization, not dramatic, not loud, just a slow understanding that no amount of authority, wealth, or planning is going to fix this, and in many cases, he too falls ill. At this point, the noble house is no longer a symbol of stability. It is simply another place where people are dying. The remaining servants, if any, may keep their distance. Basic care might continue, but the sense of duty is now mixed with caution. Rooms once filled with conversation are now silent. Corridors, once busy with movement, are empty, and the family, one by one, follows the same path we have already seen. What makes noble families slightly different is what happens afterward. When an entire household dies, the implications extend beyond personal loss. Land, titles, responsibilities, all of it suddenly becomes uncertain. If there are no immediate heirs, distant relatives may attempt to claim the estate. Legal disputes arise, records are consulted, but in a time when record-keeping itself is disrupted by widespread death, clarity is hard to find. In some cases, estates simply sit unused for a time, fields untended, buildings maintained only minimally by whoever remains nearby. It's a strange image, a large, well-built manor, quiet, not destroyed, just empty. Eventually, someone new might take possession, a distant cousin, a neighboring lord. But the continuity is broken. Generations of careful inheritance, of planned marriages, of strategic alliances, all undone in the span of a few weeks, and it wasn't rare. Across Europe, noble lineages ended abruptly during the Black Death. Names that had existed for centuries simply stopped. No grand conclusion, no dramatic fall from power, just a series of illnesses, a few hurried burials. and then silence. Let's gently move to another variation of this story, because the pattern, while consistent, had small differences depending on circumstance. Imagine a noble household that decides very early on to flee. This was not uncommon. Wealth allowed mobility. If news of the plague reached them in time, some families chose to leave their estates and move to more isolated locations, country villas, remote properties, anywhere that seemed less exposed. On paper, this sounds like a good plan, and sometimes it worked. But not always. Because the problem with fleeing is that you often bring the problem with you. Servants, belongings, supplies, any of these could carry the disease. And if even one person in the group was infected but not yet showing symptoms, the destination simply became the next site of infection. So the family arrives at their remote villa. It feels safer, quieter, removed from the chaos of cities and towns. For a few days perhaps, everything seems fine, and then, once again, someone falls ill, and now they are isolated, but in a way that works against them, because help is even further away. The same pattern unfolds. Illness spreads within the group. Care becomes difficult. Resources begin to strain. And the very isolation that was meant to protect them becomes a kind of quiet trap. Entire fleeing households sometimes perished in these remote locations, far from their main estates, far from any support, and when they were eventually discovered, it was often too late to piece together exactly what had happened. Just another silent ending. There is something almost methodical about the way the Black Death moved through families like this. It did not need drama. It did not need spectacle. It simply followed human connections, family members, servants, caretakers. The closer people were, the more likely they were to share the same fate. And yet, not every story ends the same way. In some noble households, one or two individuals survived. A younger son, a distant relative who happened to be visiting and then left early, someone who, by chance or timing, avoided infection. These survivors often inherited everything: titles, land, responsibilities, but also absence. Because inheriting a great estate is one thing, inheriting it after the complete loss of your immediate family is something else entirely. The halls are familiar, but quieter. The rooms are filled with objects that belong to people who are no longer there. Decisions must be made, duties resumed. Life, in a broader sense, continues. But the personal world has changed completely. And as we let this settle, as we picture these large, once busy households now reduced to silence or near silence, we begin to see that the Black Death did not just reduce populations. It reshaped families. It ended lines that had lasted centuries. It left behind survivors who had to rebuild, often alone, and it did all of this in a way that was strangely quiet. No grand battles, no dramatic confrontations, just a steady, almost indifferent progression through households, one after another. So, as we slowly drift onward, we can turn our attention to something slightly different: the children who survived these events, and what it meant to grow up in a world where entire families had simply disappeared. In the aftermath of the Black Death, when the fever had passed through a house and taken what it wanted, there was sometimes just one person left, and very often that person was a child, not always the strongest, not always the healthiest, just the one who happened to survive. Which, during the plague, was less about strength and more about timing, chance, and a kind of quiet biological lottery that no one fully understood. So let's imagine one of these children, a boy, perhaps 10 years old, or a girl, maybe 12, old enough to understand that something is wrong, but not old enough to process it in any structured way. They wake up one morning, and the house is still. Now, silence in a medieval household is not normal. Even modest homes had a rhythm: someone cooking, someone moving, someone coughing, complaining, doing something. But this silence is different. It lingers. At first, the child might not think much of it. People have been ill, resting, recovering. That's what they've been told. That's what they want to believe. So they move through the house slowly, calling out perhaps a soft mother or father, or the name of a sibling, no answer. And here is where the reality begins to settle, not all at once, but in small, uncomfortable pieces. They check one room, then another, and eventually they find someone, still unmoving. And even if the child doesn't fully understand death in an abstract sense, they understand enough to know that this is not sleep. Now, in a different time, this moment would be followed by adults stepping in, neighbors, relatives, someone to take control, to explain, to manage what comes next. But during the Black Death, that support system was often unavailable, because the neighbors might be ill too, or gone, or simply unwilling to come close. So the child is left with something very unusual. Responsibility, not the kind we casually give to children today, not chores or small tasks, but the quiet, heavy responsibility of existing in a house where everything has stopped, except them. They might try to wake the others, gently at first, then with more urgency, calling louder, shaking shoulders. It doesn't work. Eventually, exhaustion sets in, not just physical but emotional, though even that word, emotional, feels a bit too structured for what this is. It's more like confusion layered over fear, layered over a kind of numbness, because when something this large happens, especially to a child, the mind doesn't immediately process it. It sort of stalls. So the child continues to move through the day. They might eat something, if food is available. Bread, perhaps. Something simple. Hunger doesn't stop just because everything else has. They might sit in a familiar place, a bench, a corner, somewhere that still feels safe, even if that safety is now mostly memory. Time becomes strange. Hours pass, but they don't feel like hours. There's no structure, no routine, just a slow drifting from one moment to the next. Eventually, the child might realize they cannot stay inside, not because they've been told to leave, but because something about the house has changed. It no longer feels like a place for the living. So they step outside, and here is where the experience becomes even more disorienting, because the world outside is not normal either. Streets that were once busy are quieter, not completely empty, but subdued. People move differently now, faster perhaps, or more cautiously. Conversations are shorter, distances are maintained. If the child calls out for help, someone might hear, but help during this time is complicated. An adult might approach, but not too closely. They might ask questions. Who are you? Where are your parents? The answers, if the child can give them, are simple and heavy. They're inside. That's usually enough, because everyone understands what that means. The adult now faces a decision: offer help and risk exposure, or keep their distance and preserve their own safety. There is no easy answer here, and different people made different choices. Some children were taken in by neighbors, relatives, or even strangers. Quiet acts of compassion that, while risky, did happen. Others were directed elsewhere, to churches, to whatever form of community structure remained. And some simply wandered. It's an uncomfortable thought, but it's part of the reality. Not every story had a clear resolution. Not every child found immediate safety. For those who were taken in, life changed in a different way. They became part of a new household, often suddenly and without preparation. New rules, new faces, new expectations, and yet, even in these new environments, there was an understanding, because the people taking them in had likely experienced similar losses, The entire society, in a way, was filled with individuals who had lost someone, or many someones. So grief became normalized, not in the sense that it was less painful, but in the sense that it was everywhere, shared, understood without needing to be explained in detail. Children who survived the Black Death often grew up faster than they should have, not because anyone formally decided this, but because circumstances required it. A child who had lost their entire family might inherit property, if there was any to inherit: land, a house, small assets. And while they would not manage these things alone, the fact remained that they were now, in a technical sense, the head of what remained of their family line. It's a strange role for someone so young. Guardians were sometimes appointed. Relatives, if any, could be found. Or local authorities stepping in to manage things until the child came of age. But again, the system was under strain. With so many deaths, there were simply fewer adults available to take on these responsibilities. So some children grew up in a kind of in-between state, not fully independent, but not fully cared for either, and this had long-term effects. We don't often think about the psychological side of the Black Death, but it's worth considering. Imagine growing up in a world where death is not rare, but common, where entire families disappear within weeks, where the idea of stability feels uncertain. It changes how people think, how they plan, how they relate to others. For these children, attachment might have felt more fragile, relationships more temporary, the future less predictable, and yet life continued. It always does. Children who survived became adults. They worked, married, had families of their own, but the memory of what they experienced likely stayed with them, even if it was not always spoken about directly. And there's something quietly significant about that, because while the Black Death is often discussed in terms of numbers, millions dead, percentages of populations, it is, at its core, a collection of individual experiences like this. A child waking up in a quiet house, stepping outside into a changed world, and slowly, gradually, finding a way to keep going. Let's gently shift our focus again, drifting a little further into the social fabric of the time. Because beyond individual families and children, entire communities had to adapt to this new reality. And in some cases, the way people responded to widespread family loss took on forms that are, from our perspective, a bit unusual, not dramatic, not chaotic, just quietly different. So as we move forward, we'll look at how communities, villages, towns, even small cities, handled the fact that so many families had simply vanished, and what that meant for the people who remained. As the waves of the Black Death passed through towns and villages, leaving behind quiet houses and broken family lines, something subtle but deeply strange began to take shape. Life resumed, not in the way it had been before, not with the same energy or confidence, but in a quieter, more cautious rhythm, because the alternative, stopping entirely, was never really an option. So imagine a small town, a few months after the worst has passed. The streets are not empty anymore. People are moving again, slowly, carefully, as if the ground itself might still be uncertain. But there are gaps, houses that remain closed, doors that no one opens, windows that no longer show any sign of life. Everyone knows who used to live there. No one talks about it much, because talking about it would take too long, and in a place where nearly every person has lost someone, grief becomes less of an event and more of a background condition. The baker returns to work. Perhaps not the same baker, but someone filling the role. Bread is still needed. Hunger, as always, is very reliable. The blacksmith's forge is lit again. Tools need repairing. Life, even after widespread loss, insists on continuing its small practical needs. And then there are the fields. This is where the absence becomes especially noticeable. Fields that once required entire families to tend them are now worked by fewer hands, sometimes by neighbors who have taken on extra land, sometimes by hired workers, if any can be found, and sometimes not at all. Unworked land begins to change. Quietly, grass grows taller, boundaries blur. Nature, being very patient, starts to reclaim what was once carefully maintained. And there's something oddly calm about that, not dramatic, not destructive, just a slow return to something less structured. But humans, of course, prefer structure, so communities adapt. One of the more practical changes comes in how property is handled. With so many families gone, ownership becomes flexible. A house that once belonged to a family of 6 might now be occupied by 2 people, or 1, or reassigned entirely. In some cases, entire clusters of homes are left unused, while the remaining population gathers more tightly in one area. It's not planned in a formal sense. It just happens. People gravitate toward what remains functional, and then there are the records, or rather, the attempt to keep them. Local officials, priests, anyone responsible for documenting births, deaths, and ownership suddenly find themselves overwhelmed. The sheer number of deaths makes accurate record-keeping difficult. In some places, entries become brief, almost blunt. Died, no long descriptions, no detailed accounts, just a word, repeated again and again, until even that begins to feel routine. And here is where the emotional tone of society shifts in a way that is difficult to fully capture. When death is rare, it feels significant. When it is everywhere, it becomes normalized. Not less sad, just less surprising. People still care. They still feel loss. But the expression of that loss becomes quieter, more internal, because outward displays, repeated too often, would simply be exhausting. So instead, life takes on a kind of muted resilience. People rebuild routines. They form new households. Widows remarry. Orphans are absorbed into other families. Social structures, while damaged, begin to reassemble in slightly different forms, and sometimes in ways that would have seemed unusual before. For example, it was not uncommon for households to become more mixed, less strictly defined by traditional family lines. A surviving adult might take in unrelated children. Extended networks form, based more on necessity than blood. It's a quiet reshaping of what family means, not by choice exactly, but by circumstance. And then there is the matter of memory. In a world where so many people have died in such a short time, how do you remember them all? The answer, often, is that you don't. Not individually. That might sound a bit harsh, but it's more a matter of practicality. When loss is this widespread, memory becomes selective, focused on the closest relationships, immediate family, perhaps a few others. The rest become part of a collective understanding, a shared knowledge that many were lost, even if not every name is spoken. There's something both sad and strangely peaceful about that, because it means that the community, as a whole, carries the memory, even if individuals do not hold every detail. Now, let's gently return to the idea of a single surviving member of a family, but place them within this broader community. This person, who once belonged to a specific household, now exists in a town where many others are in the same position. They are not entirely alone, but they are no longer part of what they once were, so they adapt. They might move into a new household, or remain in their old one, with new occupants. Their daily life resumes, but with subtle differences. Meals are quieter, conversations are shorter. There is an unspoken understanding that everyone has experienced something similar, and this shared experience creates a kind of quiet bond. Not one that is openly discussed, but one that shapes interactions in small ways. A bit more patience, a bit more distance, a sense that everyone is carrying something, even if it's not visible. Over time, new families form, children are born. And here, something interesting happens. These children grow up in a world where the Black Death is not something they experience directly, but something that is always just behind the present. Their parents or guardians carry the memory, the habits, the caution, and this influences how the next generation is raised. Perhaps there is a slightly stronger emphasis on practicality, on resilience, on not taking stability for granted. Because stability, as they have learned, can change very quickly, and yet life does not become bleak. It becomes quieter, more measured. There are still moments of joy, celebrations, marriages, births, but they exist alongside an awareness that things can shift. And maybe that awareness makes those moments feel a little more grounded, a little less taken for granted. As the years pass, the immediate impact of the Black Death begins to soften, not disappear, but settle into the background. Empty houses are eventually occupied or fall into disrepair. Fields are worked again, though sometimes by different hands. Names that once filled the town are replaced by new ones. And if you were to visit this place a generation later, you might not immediately notice what had happened, at least not in a dramatic way. But if you looked closely, you would see it, in the layout of the town, in the distribution of land, in the stories people choose to tell, and the ones they quietly avoid. Because the Black Death did not just remove people, it reshaped the structure of everyday life. It changed how families formed, how communities functioned, how individuals understood their place in the world. And it did all of this without a single defining moment. No final battle, no clear ending, just a gradual shift, a before and an after. So when we ask what happened to entire families during the Black Death, the answer is both simple and complex. Many were lost, completely, quietly, without ceremony. Others were partially lost, leaving behind individuals who had to rebuild from almost nothing, and the communities around them adapted slowly, imperfectly, but persistently, because even in the face of something as overwhelming as the Black Death, people continued, not unchanged, but still here. And that quiet continuation is in its own way the final part of the story.